So Guinness have got an interesting story. Do you want to talk to me about the behavioural, what am I even saying this right? The behavioural bias, that's the word I'm looking for, isn't it? So the behavioural bias that they have played into with a lot of their marketing tactics. Because they had, I can't remember, was it 170 years? So a 260-year-old brand, but for 170 years, they did no advertising. So when they did, it got quite interesting.
Yes, that they always made the point of, we're only going to advertise when we've got something to say that's as high quality as the brand. I think that was their mantra. But the book focuses on, one particular campaign, which is an AMV campaign where they came up with this amazing line, "Good things come to those who wait." And the brilliance there is that they lean into a supposed flaw of the product rather than trying to brush it under the carpet. And the flaw of Guinness is that you have to wait. Most people before that campaign got irritated at the bar. The lager drinkers would get served immediately. The Guinness drinker had to wait almost 2 minutes to get their pint. And what was so brilliant about AMV's response, and especially the work of a creative director called Walter Campbell, was even though the brief specified that they weren't to mention the wait, that this was a really negative thing, they thought that was something that should be front and centre of the advertising. So they came up with this amazing line, "Good things come to those who wait." Now, the behavioural science principle behind that is something called the pratfall effect. So it's an idea from 1966. The original academic was a Harvard psychologist called Elliot Aronson. And in 1966, he comes up with this idea that if you admit a flaw, you become more appealing. So for the original study, he recruits a colleague. He gets that colleague to take part in a quiz. Aronson has given that contestant all the questions beforehand. So the guy does amazingly well. The contestant does brilliantly, gets 92% of the questions right, wins the quiz by miles, looks like an absolute genius. But then as the quiz is coming to a close, he makes a small blunder, what an American would call a pratfall in the 60s. He spills his coffee down himself. Now, Aronson has recorded all of this, and he takes the recording, he plays it to listeners, but he plays the listeners one of two versions. So some listeners hear the entire incident, great performance and spillage. Other listeners hear an edited version where the spillage is removed, they just hear the amazing quiz performance. Everyone is then questioned as to their feelings towards the contestant. And what Aronson finds is that the listeners, or the group that listen to the mistake and the performance, they rate their contestant 45% more appealing versus the group who just heard the amazing quiz performance. So Aronson calls this the pratfall effect. And it's essentially the idea that if you emphasise a flaw, you become more appealing. And I think that, and there are lots of other reasons why it works so well, which we'll maybe delve into, but that I think is fundamental to the success of Guinness. It's this rare use of a really powerful bias that boosts appeal. And then I think on top of that appeal, it's distinctive. Most adverts brag. So if you admit a flaw, you're standing out, you can get noticed straight away. And if you admit a weakness in your product, you have tangibly proved your honesty. Everything else you say becomes that more believable. So if you admit you're slow, people are more likely to believe that you're high quality. So I think it's one of the best ever lines written in advertising.
Yeah, I think going back to what we were talking about earlier, it builds that trust, doesn't it? Because like you say, you're being honest. Like, we're not good at being fast, we're slow, but that's because of the quality of the product that we're creating. And you should, good things do come to those who wait, and that's why you need to wait.
Yeah, trust is absolutely part of it. And this is where one bias kind of almost blends into another. There is a separately named bias called the stolen thunder effect. And the original research was done by Kipling Williams at the University of Toledo. And he runs an experiment where he gets people to read through mock trials. So you hear the defendant's or the defense lawyer's argument, and then you hear the prosecution's. And he does a couple of different versions. First version, you hear the defence lawyer making a reasonably powerful case about why the defendant is innocent. And then you hear the prosecution who have a powerful critique of that defence. And that group say whether they think the defendant is guilty or not. Second group of people, they hear exactly the same content. So slightly flawed defence argument, then powerful critique. But there is an extra couple of sentences on the defence's part in which they admit there is a weakness in their case. They admit the problem that the prosecution then interrogates. The crucial thing to point out here is they just admit the flaw in their defence case. They don't in any way try and justify it or counterbalance it. They're not giving any information about why that flaw's not a genuine one. They just admit to it. And the group that read that set of defence and prosecution information, they're much more likely to think the defendant is innocent. Williams's argument is if you admit something that is not seemingly in your self-interest, it gives all your other arguments more credibility because you have shown that you're prepared to admit information that could be damaging. Everything else you say has greater credibility. So yeah, absolutely. I think it also, this line, builds great trust and great believability.